Will you take a moment to introduce yourself?
Of course. My name is Cathy Kuhlmeier. I was the lead plaintiff involved in the Hazelwood v. Kuhlmeier School District landmark case. The decision came down in January of 1988.
All right, and we'd like to dig a little bit deeper on how this case has affected you and others.
Okay. Can you give me more specifics as far as what you're looking for?
Well, when you were in high school, how did this affect you?
Well, during the time that I was in high school, it was a little more intimidating at that point because some of my friends didn't understand what all was going on with it and what we were trying to do. So there was a division of friends. Some teachers also didn't understand, and there was pressure from Mr. Reynolds, our high school principal, that made me feel very uncomfortable as a high school kid.
Okay, and what impact do you think the newspaper issue that you and other students wrote would have had left on the school if it had been published?
I think the biggest thing that would have impacted our students was that we recognize the fact that every article written doesn't always impact everybody in some type of fashion, doesn't relate. But if you can do your job as a journalist and make a difference to one student, then you've done your job. That being said, the story that talked about teen pregnancy wasn't the how-tos and the why-fors. It was the suggestion of consider your options before you consider having teen sex and what that impact could potentially be upon yourself, the gentleman, as well as family members. So it was just suggesting to consider your options before you act on that. The story that I think would have made the biggest difference that didn't have the opportunity to run was on runaways, because within that story it gave reasons why someone would potentially run away, and it gave hotline numbers also where if you were in that situation and considering taking that next step, that maybe you would make a phone call and get some help rather than making the option of running away, because that is very impactful in your life. So the stories were intended to help others, and the main impact, generally speaking, is that high school is hard enough for anyone involved in high school, and sometimes you feel like you're the only one going through a situation, and maybe had the articles been given the opportunity to run, other kids would feel like they're not the only ones walking in that particular walk and feeling so lonely, and like high school is the worst thing ever.
Mm-hmm. And I know that you said you were in high school when this case happened, but at what point did you realize the possible national consequence of your case?
I think as the case started brewing and we started seeing the national and local media coverage of things that were going on with it is when it started recognizing what was happening. But long-term impact, I think it was really seeing my name in textbooks and recognizing that this has become a great big deal.
Mm-hmm. And did you think Spectrum would have had this lasting impact?
Absolutely not. We were just concerned with getting the articles published to help our co-students. At that point in time, we really had no idea or intention that this would grow into what it has now, almost 40 years later.
Did your opinion of the lasting impact change as the case continued through the court systems from the trial all the way to the Supreme Court?
I think it really kind of remains steady, just with the desire to continue to fight for what we believed in. When we lost in the Missouri Supreme Court, we kind of had the intention that it would go to appellate courts, but actually making it to the U.S. Supreme Court was a pretty far cry, and it was something that I don't think any of us really ever anticipated happening. The hardest portion of all of it was not knowing that the case was being heard at the U.S. Supreme Court level, and I wasn't asked to go and participate in that. So something that carries my name, that has followed me for so many years, that I should have been a very part of and should have been able to hear the actual testimony at the Supreme Court level, I didn't get to participate in.
Mm-hmm. I can totally understand how that would have been very upsetting. Do you think high schoolers today would benefit from the journalism students at Hazelwood's willingness to take the school to court?
I think students need to learn that they have rights. So I think part of the message that came from Hazelwood is empowering students to stand up and talk about their rights that they are given through the First Amendment, and through the Tinker decision of students do not shed the rights at the schoolhouse gate. I think without that having happened, I think kids anymore self-censor themselves, and they're afraid to use their voices because of what repercussions could be, and it's just easier to shut up and not say anything.
Mm-hmm. How have you seen the decision of the Supreme Court firsthand?
I've seen it happen where censorship is continuing to happen. It's happening across the country. It's happened to my own son during his junior year of high school. And it's unfortunate to see that it is still happening, that 18 states have currently passed the New Voices law where it says that they can't censor anymore. But that leaves a lot of opportunity for other states and schools to work on getting those rights corrected.
Mm-hmm. It's so interesting how the exact same thing happened once again in your family years later, and how you had to relive it almost.
Very much so. The way that it paralleled my story was pretty uncanny. It happened during my son's junior year of high school. He also had a new advisor due to the current previous advisor leaving, as well as a new principal, and all of that mirrored just exactly what happened to me. Threats were also made to my son and his staff when the censorship happened, that if the kids continue to press the issue with the article running, or the desire for the article to run, that letters of recommendation for college would be revoked. And my son was also told that he would not be allowed to be the editor-in-chief next year. And threats like that, whether they're acted upon or not, are still threats, and that creates an unsafe environment for students in the high school arena, and that should never be the case. You should always feel safe in what you're doing and where you're at in your high school.
Mm-hmm. And you mentioned that you do quite a bit of work still with this case. How has this series of events fueled your personal activism on this topic of student First Amendment rights and protections?
It has pushed me to want to be the one to fight for the underdog, to fight for the high school kid, for the person that's been wronged, for the person that is afraid to speak up. Through the course of all the years, I have traveled across the state. I attend national conferences. I speak at high schools. I speak for wherever will schedule me to come and talk to, such as this program through SCOTUS Historical. And it's just something that has become very passionate to me to try and help those people to let their voices be heard. Presently, I have a foundation that has evolved through the course of all of this called Super Original, the Cathy Kuhlmeier Foundation. But the purpose behind the organization is to help student journalists with their rights, to let them know that this is a safe place to come and talk to us, where we can help you get direction. We partner with Student Press Law Center of Washington, D.C. to empower the kids to talk about things, because if you're not using your voices, you're losing them.
Mm-hmm. And I think it's so interesting to talk about like how this is happening today, but what do you think would have happened if Kuhlmeier v. Hazelwood would have happened today, in today's time, in today's society?
I would like to think that we would have had an attorney that would have been a better support system for us, would have talked about the things that were relevant that didn't get mentioned in the Supreme Court. Things like the article topics had been previously published underneath a different principle. The names had all been changed and names were removed, and we had consent from the students as well as the parents for what was being written and published. So I think if someone would have used that knowledge and presented that to the courts, I think at that point we would have had a different verdict of what came down. But I think also the takeaway for me at this point, knowing what I know now, would have been to research more of who is presenting for us rather than accepting it, that attorney had our best interest to heart.
And what do you think students can do, or any individuals do, to get involved in First Amendment rights?
Stand up and talk about it. There is a movement across the country called New Voices of USA, and it proceeds at state level. There, like I mentioned earlier, there's 18 different states that have passed New Voices laws, and the activism behind that is students getting involved, talking to House of Representatives, the state senators, also getting your parents, who are generally the registered voters in the household, to write letters and talk about it. Be an activist for it. If it's something that you're concerned about, and it doesn't have to be just student rights or something that has happened. It can just be something with just supporting the movement of restoring student journalist rights, because it is continuing to happen. And so what students, family, advisors need to do is to write letters and email, get in front of the state representatives, go into the House of Representatives, talk to them. If there's a bill that is actually giving motion, go in and give testimony about it. Get the advisors to talk about what's happened with them. I go in and do the same thing, whatever states where it's active, to talk about it and make noise about it. Because again, if we're not talking about it, we're losing our rights. And the intent of all of this is to restore it and get all 50 states on board with having new voices to restore the rights to student journalists.
Mm-hmm. And before we wrap up, is there any other lasting impacts that this case has made on your life that you would like to address?
I think the most important thing, and we've kind of touched on a little bit, is that empowering students, because as a high school student, you may feel, I'm just a kid, what difference do I make? But in reality, you matter the world. And change becomes with starting with one person. And if one person has just the smallest amount of courage to stand up and talk about something that matters to them, that's how we can make change, because we talk about it. We want something better. We want to be the difference. So one high school student absolutely can be the difference and be the change. So as long as you're willing to have that little bit of courage, stand up, talk about things, and be what can become better in our world.
All right. Thank you so much.
You're welcome. Have a great day.
You too.